So no, it's great to be up here with you guys, and it's always a little bit humbling. So maybe we could just start off with prayer. I know several of you are praying for me, which I desperately need. So let's pray, and we'll get started. Lord, I just thank you for this time. I just thank you for this church body, that we can just dive into your word, Lord. I pray that you would be with me as we go through this, that I would apply it correctly, and that it would be edifying. And we just thank you for what you've done for us and just the blessings that you've given us. And we just say this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So normally when I get up here, there's a little bit of marital strife because my wife is like, oh, man, like, I know you're going to talk about me when you're up there. And she does not like that. So I've already given Tony $20 to make sure that the recording does not work. And unfortunately, she knew kind of where I was at, so Lynn has promised to tell her everything that I might say about her. So it's always interesting when you get asked to preach, when you're not the main guy. Usually it comes around to, like, what is God either teaching you or you need to start paying attention to? And it's always kind of humbling because you're like, well, I get to get up here for 30 to 40 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, Tony's giving me the look, and explain what is not going well in my life and how I'm trying to fix that. So as I'm sitting at my house and I'm like, oh, what am I screwing up? What am I screwing up? That's when my wife is sitting there and she's like, do you know what I dreamt last night? And I'm like, oh man, here it comes. So my wife is interesting when you get paired up with your spouse. I usually like large crowds. I like people. I like to wander around, talk to people. She does not like that. She likes to know where I'm at. She doesn't want to talk to anybody unless she has to, and I cannot disappear. So she tells me, she's like, do you know what I dreamt? And I'm like, oh man. She's like, I dreamt that we were at a big party and we were walking in and you're doing your typical thing of talking to everybody and running around, and then all of a sudden I can't find you. And I'm just running around going, where are you? Where are you? And I'm like, I'm already getting in that mind. Have we all done that? Have you had to defend yourself to your spouse over a dream? We've been married for over 20 years. I've had to do it a few times. So I'm like geared up, ready to defend myself against something that I didn't do. When she turns and looks at me and she says, where are you? And for a minute, I'm like, but I realized at that moment we had stopped talking about her dream and being angry to a very specific point of where are you? And, it was at that point I'm like, here we go. Like, this is it. Because the truth is that I haven't been very present for quite a while. And it was very interesting to have her say, where are you? And it just like kicked off in my brain that I'm like, well, I think this is God. This is what God is wanting to talk to me about. And it's interesting because, as David's been talking and doing his sermons in Romans, it's great. Last week, he was talking about Joseph and how great Joseph was and everything that he did. And all I can think through that whole message is, I am not Joseph. Like, I screw up everything. Like, I'm the opposite. I feel like I'm probably more like his brothers, like scheming, messing things up, always tripping over myself. And it just made me think about, most of the characters in the Bible are in that position. There's very few Josephs in the Bible. And so to me, that just was a little bit of an encouragement because I think most of us are probably not like Joseph. There's a few of us in here, and if we're really honest, they annoy us, right? They're always perfect. You're like, you don't ever screw anything up, but I do every day for both of us. So that I felt like was where God was at. And just like, what is it that he was trying to tell me? And I think the interesting thing is when you shift to the characters that have messed up, like, what is it about those characters that stand out to us? And it's that they have a cool redemption story. Like, the more they mess up, the more it highlights the cool thing that they did at the end of it. And so I was just looking at that and I'm like, wow. And it just made me think, like, my favorite redemption story, I love football. My favorite story is Michael Vick. Like, in the day when Michael Vick was at Virginia Tech, he was awesome. Probably the greatest athlete I've ever seen. And he was one of the first to just be just this unreal runner, could throw the ball 50 yards flat-footed. He was awesome. But on the back end, Michael Vick was just not a good person. He ended up getting convicted, as some of you probably know, for dogfighting. Just a terrible person. Got sent to jail, in the prime of his career. And then Tony Dungy takes an interest in him, witnesses to him. He gets converted in prison, eventually gets out of prison, and changed his whole life. And it's interesting to me because he lost like the best years of his life, football-wise, but he gained everything on the back end. So I love that story because I'm like, man, I could not stand that guy when he was in college. And now every time I listen to him, I'm just like, gosh, I love this guy. Like listening to him talk about explaining to his daughter why they can't have dogs. Like, man, that is humbling. And just to hear that and what he's done, and Tony Dungy, the work that he does, it was awesome. And so, I look at those people that are separated, and I just thought today it would be a good opportunity for us to look at some characters in the Bible that have been separated from God and what their redemption story was. And from there to look at like specific instances that we separate ourselves from God, that these people did, and how we can turn that. So, see if the clicker works here. Turn it on. Maybe. Can you advance it, Jenny? So today we're going to talk about some separation points. The first one is just obviously sin, good old-fashioned sin, messed up. The next one is going to be denying God. The next one is pleading with God and not receiving the answer that we want. The other one is when we're serving God and it's not giving us the results that we want. Other times we suffer when we're serving God. And then we're going to talk about prolonged periods of separation from God. Go ahead, Jen. So the first one, and this is what it hit me when Amy hit me first thing in the morning when I'm defending myself from her dreams. Where are you? It's the original sin, and it's the original format that kind of follows through today. I mean, everybody knows the story. Adam and Eve get, I wouldn't say tricked, but convinced by the serpent to eat the fruit because they want to be more like God. God comes into the garden and says, where are you? God didn't need to ask where you are. I mean, he could physically tell where they were at. He was asking relationally, where are you? Because he knew that they were hiding. And I think that that is kind of the format that God is asking us through our lives. That's the first question that he'll ask us is, where are you? And I think it's important to know that at this point, they've committed a sin, and there's consequences to the sin. They have to wear clothes now. They get moved out of the Garden of Eden. There is consequences, but God sets up a process to still be faithful to them and then sets up a process to correct this sin thousands of years in the future. So it's kind of the format that we look at now going forward is we're probably going to sin. There's probably going to be consequences. But those consequences shouldn't permanently separate us from God. He still wants to have that relationship with us. So to me, that was kind of the first wake-up call, when Amy asked where you are, like that's all I could imagine was myself hiding, partially clothed in some bushes somewhere emotionally. And I needed to come out of there and reestablish my relationship with God. The next one. So Peter, I've said it over and over again, Peter is probably who, for the first half of his life, who I relate to the most. Like over and over and over, every story about Peter is him messing up in some way. Like every way imaginable, Peter is messing up. But when you get to the end of Jesus' ministry, it was really, he committed probably his worst mess up. When Jesus, they're sitting there and he's like, hey, you're going to deny me 3 times before this is over. And I know I can be in this position when we're in like this church environment or we're at men's group and it's like, I would never deny God. I would do this and that. You get out into the real world and it's like, oh, like what is going on? So for me, the industry I work in, there's not a lot of God honoring stuff. It's just not in there. And you a lot of times feel like you're kind of the Lone Ranger. It just is, God is not part of the discussion. And sometimes where you're not just saying, hey, like, God, I don't, you're not denying like the way Peter is, but sometimes you're kind of, the undercurrents are like where there's opportunities to maybe be bold about it, comments being made, and you don't really say anything. So there's times like that where I have just felt guilty, where I'm just like, man, I just missed my chance. Like, I missed my chance. God is going to be furious with me. I feel terrible. Like, I missed it. And it's just easy to just like, suck back into that and just say, what good am I to God? Like he says very specifically not to deny him, and then I just sat here and did it. But I think that it's encouraging when you look at Peter, who did that. Eventually, what happens? Jesus comes back to him, and he repeats 3 times. Simon, when he says, do you love me? And he asks him 3 times, and he offsets the denial of 3 times by, yes, I love you. And then he's like, okay, feed my sheep, take action. And then you look at Peter, and as much of a mess up as he was his whole life, what is he doing when you turn the page into Acts? He's suddenly the leader of the church, and he's just like this rock that everybody comes down to. Even Paul defers to him. Everybody defers to him, where when you look previously, he's denying God, cowering in a corner, not afraid to stand up to a slave girl. But then he turns around and just like, with Jesus' help and a reminder that, hey, I know you messed up, but I still love you. Like, let's put that behind us and let's move forward. So for me, that's always kind of a hard thing, is like when I mess up, can I accept God's love and move on? And Peter is just a great example of that. So the next one, David. So I think everybody knows David's story. I mean, David is about as bad as it gets. I mean, what he did, has an affair, arranges to have her husband killed. Like, I'm just sitting there going, well, I mess up on a daily basis, but I haven't done that. I mean, I haven't thought about it. So, I mean, it's just like, how is it that he came back? And I think the good point about David is, the part that moves on is not that he just sinned and there was a redemption story, but I think a lot of us can relate when we've sinned and there's consequences to that sin. Like, those are usually your most heartfelt prayers of pleading to God to like get rid of the consequences of that sin. And in this particular instance, after it happened, David's son fell sick, and he prayed and prayed and prayed for God to heal his son, and he didn't. Like, eventually the son just died. And I think the interesting part about this, that's the hardest for me, is what David did, like when that was over. He pleaded with God. When he received his answer, he got up, washed himself, anointed, and went and worshiped God. Like, he accepted it and he moved on. And that for me is like one of the hardest parts that I have. I can't just move on. Like, I just let it keep dragging me back and dragging me back and dragging me back. And you think about David, like committing that, what he did, and then later is described as a man after God's own heart. Like, you look at those two things and you're just like, how is that possible? And I think it's in there just because it's a good example for us. Like, look, when it happens, it's time to just accept it and move on. And God is like, that's the whole thing. God is like, yep, you did it. There was consequences, but that doesn't define the rest of your life. Up to that point, it does. But from there, you still have a whole life left that you can keep moving on. So this one, any of these, like, I would encourage you guys to go and read these sections. Like, we could do whole sermons on each of these sections, but this one right here is probably my favorite that I spent the most time on, was Elijah. Elijah, I kind of can sympathize a little bit with Elijah, because when you go into like serving God, you're like, and there's no reason to think this, but you just have this mindset of like, everything's going to be great. Everything's going to be easy. God's going to do this, and I'm going to do this. And you get into serving, and it's like, no. You're like David. You walk into church with a black eye. half the time, which I don't know if that was service related. I think it might have been one of his kids. But you have some black eyes once in a while when you're serving, and when you get in there and you're just like, what is going on? Like, I'm trying to do this for you, God. Like, why am I getting punched in the face? And Elijah's story is very interesting because I feel like his story is a good transition point. So Elijah, if you're not familiar with it or don't remember, like, it's a very dark point in this section of Kings where most of God's prophets have been killed. There's been a drought for a long time. The prophets that are remaining are hiding in caves. You've got Ahab and Jezebel that are just like ruling everything. There's extreme pagan worship. You've got Baal and Asher, and that's what everybody's doing. And then you've got Elijah here, and it's just grim. But then what does Elijah do? He goes down to Obadiah and he says, hey, go get everybody that's hiding and bring them down here because I'm going to show you something cool. So they go down, they build altars, and they're like, hey, prophets of Baal and Asher, like, let's have a little competition here. We're going to put a sacrifice on these altars, and let's see whose God can actually bring fire down, and we'll see who's who. So they go through this. The prophets of Baal, they like go through all this craziness of pleading and going crazy trying to get their God to do something. Well, there's nothing. Nothing happens. And then Elijah's like, let me show you something cool. Calls on God, fire comes out, like burns everything up, including, I think, the stones. And then they grab all of these prophets of Baal and Asher and kill them. And Elijah's like, we're back. Like, we're back. God is here. We're going to move forward. But then what happens next? Ahab goes to Jezebel and he's like, hey, this just happened. Like, what do we want to do? And they're like, let's kill Elijah and we'll kill everybody. What you did, we're going to do to them. And Elijah is just like, what? Like, I thought we were here for a great victory. And he's just destroyed. He goes, finds kind of a secluded place, hides under a tree, and it's just like, what is going on, God? You may as well just kill me. Like, what are we doing here? Like, I thought we were having a great victory. And it's interesting because at that point, God sends 2 angels to feed Elijah. And at that point, I mean, if an angel showed up to me and was like, hey, I'm going to give you some food, I would be like, wow, this is pretty cool. But from what we see in the text, and I would encourage you just to read through this text, it is awesome. You know, Elijah takes the food the first time, they come and feed him again, and then they're like, hey, like, we need you to go on this journey. It's going to be like 40 days, like, get fed, start going. So I'm like, okay, Elijah's back. He's doing the same thing. Well, he gets to where he's going, and instead of like shifting to serving God, he goes and hides in a cave. And he's sitting in there, and God whispers to him and says, Elijah, what are you doing? And you see this transition point from where are you spiritually to what are you doing? And Elijah still sits in there, and he's like, well, I don't know. And God's like, I'm going to show you who I am. He says, I want you to go out of this cave, and I'm going to show you who I am. And he stays in there, doesn't go out. God shows up first as like a massive wind that just like destroys the mountains, ripping things apart, going crazy. Then he comes back through with a huge earthquake. Then he comes back through, if that's not enough, with just fire raining down. And then God says, get out here. And from that point, he says, keep moving. And from that point, he sent him to find Elisha to continue the ministry. And I feel like for me personally, like once Amy brought up, where are you? And I spent this whole week like going, where am I relationally with God? Because it just doesn't feel that good. And then I'm like, okay, I kind of know where I'm at and what I need to do. And then when I went through this passage, I felt like the transition became, what are you doing? And then after that, it became, if you don't start doing something, I'm going to show you who I am. And I know that we all have kind of the fuzzy, warm gods in the background, but from that point right there, I don't know that I want to face God to that magnitude. And I just feel like he's getting to that point where he's like, I'm done trying to get your attention the soft way. I sent people to help you. encourage you, and now I expect something out of you. I expect some action. And so to me, this is just a good reminder of, yeah, we're going to get knocked down, but God is going to be there to take care of us. But at the end of it, that's not it. Like, he expects action. The next one kind of goes hand in hand with this, suffering while serving. I know that can be hard for people. Jeremiah was a good example. Prophet of God, thinks he's out serving, ends up in stocks, getting tormented, and he just loses heart. And if you go through and read that section of Jeremiah, like, his lamentations to God are just like, what is going on here? Like, did you deceive me? Why was I even born? Like, what is going on? And then at the end of it, he gets to the end of it and says, even though I'm angry, I can't not proclaim your name because it will come from my bones. As if they're a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I cannot hold it in. So even when you get beat up, spiritually, emotionally, physically, like, God will keep you going, like, even when you feel like you can't. It's always amazing to me, like, being up here and looking, like, out here at this church building. Like, I'm still amazed at this, mostly because Dave and Jenna have good decorating taste. But, like, what I used to think about going to church was, I don't want to set up chairs anymore. Man, I don't want to set up chairs. When I get to heaven, I want an accounting of how many chairs I set up in that cloverleaf. Just furious. But during that time as well, I mean, there was a lot of emotional just thrashings that were taken, just in a new church plant. I still may have some tics or PTSD from it. But when I get up here and I look at this, I'm like, if someone would have told me 10 years ago when I was setting up those chairs with Jenny and Duff and everybody else complaining and griping because it was 20 degrees below zero and we had to dump water on the locks to get the trailer open. Man, I hate sound equipment. Like, we need to just be acoustic. I don't care if we get to leave it here. Nothing against it, Brian. Just, I've got some bad feelings about it. But, it's just amazing when you get to this point, because if I would have thought back then, I would have been like, there's no way it's worth it. There's no way that it's worth it to do this every Sunday. There's no way that it's worth it to have relational breakdowns that just come about in that setting. Like, I would have said it wasn't worth it. But now that I'm sitting here on the other side, I'm like, it was totally worth it. So I just think that that's a good reminder. It's easy to be, it's easy to really get beat up while you're trying to suffer or while you're trying to serve. And I thought that was good when, I still can't call them Thrive. CB Northwest came out and talked about just how important it is for David and Jenna, because I am telling you that this is hard. Like, you get beat up a lot. So, but thanks, David. If I come up here once in a while to do this to make it better for you, that's good. You'll probably never invite me back up here again, but that's okay.
We do it next week.
All right. So this is one that I probably relate to the most. Well, I don't know. I relate to all of them. I fail on all fronts. But Moses was an interesting one, because if you think back to Moses' story, when he was living in Egypt, he saw an Egyptian beating on a Hebrew, got mad, went in there and killed the guy. And I think probably he's like, oh, I defended you, and would expect kind of a reaction that I was defending you. But instead, he got criticized by another Hebrew, and they're like, who are you to do this? Like, who put you in charge? And then he's like, crap, I'm going to get killed. And so he just like flees and is out in the desert. And there's a little bit of like ways to back into this, but he was probably out there for about 40 years. So they say that when the thing with the Egyptian happened, he was about 40. When he showed back up to Pharaoh, he was probably in his 80s. So for 40 years, Joseph is out in the desert. He did find a wife, found a family, which is good. But what do you think he was thinking about for 40 years? He was probably thinking about what he did with that Egyptian. Just a terrible person, what I am, what I did. I mean, there's really nothing of note in that time that he did to serve God. And this week, I stumbled across quote from C.S. Lewis, and he said, "Good and evil both increase at compound interest." So think about, like, it's common in my family, like we're always, I don't know, not always, but occasionally we're fighting with each other. And it's just like, sometimes I'll talk to like one of my brothers or sisters and they're like, "I haven't talked to so-and-so in 2 years." And I'm like, what? But just think about how many times we do that, where it's just like, well, I'm not going to address it tomorrow. And you feel bad, and then you feel worse the next day, and then all of a sudden it's been 2 years, and you're like, well, I really don't want to deal with it now. So you just keep on perpetuating. You just keep on going. And I don't know that any of us have done anything for 40 years, but just think how Moses felt for 40 years of just like every day it's getting worse and worse and worse. And then one day he's wandering along, and there's a burning bush. So he's probably like, well, I mean, I still would have a hard time with the burning bush. That would be hard to even realize what was going on. But think about when God reached out to Moses and said, "This is what I want you to do." And Moses' response, I think, sums up for me how I feel a lot of times. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? When you think about that in the context that he's probably been stewing about this for 40 years, like, wouldn't you just be like, "God, you can't find somebody better"? I mean, I feel like that every day. David feels like that every day for me. Right? Sometimes. But 40 years, and I feel like that for me, that's just kind of a common thing. And I think a lot of us, if we're honest, we do put that as, we just procrastinate knowing what we need to do, which then just makes it worse and worse as time goes on. But what did Moses do? Did he say, "Find somebody else, God? Good luck"? No. He's like, well, if I'm the best you can find, I guess we're going to do this. Goes to Pharaoh, does exactly what God says. Was he perfect? No. Led God's people out of there. I mean, you think about from where he came from to what he ended up doing. I mean, it's just another awesome redemption story. And it's just a good reminder, especially for me, is no matter how much time I've put between an issue and what God wants, it doesn't matter. Like, it's not getting any better tomorrow. So I may as well fix it today. So Moses, good example. You guys can't see my pictures very well. I spent a lot of time with AI making those pictures, and they're all too dark. Has anybody used AI lately? It's crazy. So, all right. So, unfortunately, we've got a lot of good examples of redemption stories, people falling away from God and having just cool stories later on. But there is one story in here that I think is a cautionary tale, and for me, it really kind of hit home with me this week, and that's Judas. So Judas, if you think about, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I keep going, yeah, like Judas betrayed God. He betrayed Jesus and sent him. But in the end, did Judas do anything really that much worse than those other characters that we just went through? Like, Peter denied God. David had people killed, had an affair. I mean, everybody else was bad. The difference with Judas that hit me is he didn't turn back to God. And I'll just say, listening when David was going through the first part of Romans, like, I was really having a hard time with the bad news. And I remember there was one particular sermon that David gave that just like really drove into like the separation of God and where that leads. And I was like, I think that might have been too far, and I struggled with it and I had a hard time with it. But then when I went through this week, it hit me, and it's like, we need to not sugarcoat where it leads if we stay separated from God. Like, it's going to be bad all the way through. So, I look at this story and I just, I understand that this was God's will and God's purpose, but you almost kind of wonder the way that Jesus treated Judas. Like, the whole time he treated him well. Like, nobody knew who it was that was going to betray him, which, I mean, if I'm hanging out with 12 of my buddies and I know that one of them is going to betray me, there'll probably be some signs that I know that. And even when Judas came and kissed Jesus and betrayed him, Jesus didn't react crazy. He was still just like, do what you need to do. And it just always makes me wonder, like, as terrible as Judas' story was, like, what would it have been like if he would have actually, instead of running and hanging himself, would have came back to God? Like, that story would have been amazing, but he didn't. So, for me, this one hit home just because, as I've said, when I'm trying to go through this stuff and I'm working on my own life, like, I've probably been in kind of a funky season for it's been a little while, probably a little over 2 years. And I felt like this summer was probably like ground zero for me, like at the beginning of the summer. And I had some pretty wild ideas going through my head. And it just like got to the point where it just like kind of almost scared me to a point. I was like, Amy, we got to talk, And we just went out for a drive out north. And I'm like, this is where I'm at. And it's just like, she doesn't even know what to say. She's like, what is going on? She almost drove us off the road because I wasn't driving. But it's just still fresh in my mind of where you can get to when you stay separated from God and you don't come back. Like, you can get yourself in some pretty bad places. And so, with that, I will say, like, once you verbalize it, like, there is something helpful about just verbalizing that. Like, I'm the king of stupid ideas, but when I say it, I'm like, that was a stupid idea. But sometimes it doesn't sound stupid until you say it. So I think that, we're called to confess with each other, especially with our spouses. And that was kind of the beginning for me of just like a trajectory out of that deep, dark hole, was just that I need to just tell you what's going on in my mind. But I think that we just can't discount, as much as I didn't want to hear it, what David was talking about in the first part of Romans. The bad news is really bad, but the good news is really good. So, looking at all this, I was asking myself this week, I'm like, why is it that I love redemption stories? I love them. I love Michael Vick. I love going through all this stuff, but I will not apply a redemption study or scenario to myself. Why is it that I think it's so great, but when I screw up to this point, I just want to wallow in the mud and not do anything? Like, why is that? And so I think that there's probably some of us that feel that way too. Like, we love it, but we don't apply that same grace to ourselves. And I think that that's what Jesus is calling us to. Apply that same grace. Like, whatever you've done, as crazy as it is, and I'm not saying this to go justify some crazy action, but man, you think about the redemption stories that you really love, and it's the people that were the deepest in the pit. And when they come out to the other side, it's like, holy cow. Like, that gets me excited and fired up to move forward. So for me, it was a good thing that Amy asked me a couple weeks ago, where are you? Because it forced me to just unpack these things. And the interesting thing is the more I unpacked them, the more I'm like, man, I'm excited. Like, what does God have for me? Like, I can't do anything about things in the past, but it's time to draw a line in the sand and move forward. So I would say, as you're going about your life, I know some of us, for me personally, I'm like, boy, I'd sure like you to send me a couple angels to feed me. Or, even a burning bush would be kind of cool, Or I'd like to see some stuff caught on fire. Like, that's just not how God works anymore. But God puts people in your lives. He puts the Tony Dungies in your life that are doing the same thing. Your spouse, your friends, just people can see you, and people know when something's off. Like, if you're separated from God, chances are the rest of your life isn't going very well. It's just like a dashboard. Like, just pay attention to it. The other thing is I would say, is if you know somebody's like struggling and you can feel that, like, it's okay to be the Tony Dungy, and it's okay to like reach out to people and just say, hey, I know how you, like, doesn't look like it's going well. Like, what can we do? So today I would just say, if you're like me and you've been in this season where it's just like, man, I feel like I've been separated from God and just wallowing in it and not giving myself the same grace that he's given everybody else. Today is the day to step back into that grace. Once you reestablish that relationship, and then from there, it's like, what is the redemption story that you have for me? That's exciting. So with that, I'll go ahead and pray. Have the band come back up. Lord, I just thank you for this day. I thank you just for your kindness, Lord, and your patience. That even though we love Joseph, we love that story, we're probably a lot more, at least I am, like the other characters in your story that just seem to be always looking for ways to mess up. But no matter what situation we're in, you're calling us back. You're calling us back to that relationship with us. And from there, you're calling us back to what are you going to do with that relationship? So I just pray that anybody that's in that position today, that you would just draw them close and just help them just feel your love, Lord. I thank you for it. I thank you for the redemption that you've offered all of us. And just say this in Jesus' name. Amen.